collection of ancestral diaries is in completion of her second book, Dueling Dragons. Recounts the key years of I can't say this word, tumultuous. Tumultuous, I don't know. You know what I'm saying? I can't say that. History in the 19th century Ireland through the lives of three remarkable men. Marjorie was born in Minneapolis to an Irish family and later settled in Ipswich. She taught in public schools and later joined the I'm having trouble. Ipswich School Committee. From writing for a weekly newspaper, she discovered a story from Irish families' connection to the 19th century. Welcome, Marjorie.
Thank you. Ordinarily, I speak with groups that I consider friends and I just talk. But as I got older, I discovered that there were really awkward moments of silence when I transitioned from one subject to another. So I sort of write things out, but then I interrupt myself as I go along. And if you have any questions along the line, please ask them. Now, since all of you people, excuse me, know each other, no? I think it's wonderful you have a genealogy society. If I lived closer, I would be immediately joining, because I can't think of anything more fun than getting together with a group of people who are interested in the same things that I am interested in. Let me just explore. How many of you actually have connections with Ireland? If you just, oh, isn't that lovely? The Irish did seem to take off. How many of you have finished your Irish family searches? I know the feeling. Okay, so I'm going to explain to you how to do things wrong, because I did almost everything wrong. If you run into roadblocks, you can learn from my experiences. So I come less as an expert than in like a seasoned and professional genealogist would be, more as a person who has walked your walk and, as I say, have done almost everything wrong. And before I start my remarks, let me just set up a little bit the very abnormal situation that your ancestors, your Irish ancestors, ran into in Ireland. Ireland, from the time of St. Patrick's, was a Catholic country. All the Irish were Catholics. And it wasn't until the early 1600s when troubles in Scotland, battles the Scotch were having with the English, persecutions of the Scotch Presbyterian Church led to the settlements of the northern part of Ireland. It made sense because it was closer to Scotland than further south. And so now you had a Protestant group of Scotch coming over and infiltrating the territory that had always previously been Catholic. And this was not a smooth transition. It was more of a problem in Ulster than it was in the south, because the Protestant Scotch never actually made it all the way down to the lower coasts and the western coast. They remained pretty much Catholic territory. But the Scotch were very fierce people, and they were very aggressive people. And I'll tell you a little side story. One of my Irish ancestors came early in around 1730. So this was the first big batch of Irish immigrants. And they were mainly these Scotch-Irish from refugees from Scotland. They left because they had come in the plantation. So we're talking 1630, 1640. They came They got their pieces of land, which they had driven the Catholic population away from with a series of very nasty battles. When they came, they got leases to the land for 3 generations. Have you heard of that? That meant the immigrant got a piece of land. He could pass it on to all of his children. Then they could pass it on until they got to the last surviving grandchild. And then the lease was done. And the landlord could release it at whatever rates he wanted and under what conditions he wanted. So a lot of the Ulster people, the Scotch, were not happy about that. They had spent 3 generations toiling on a piece of land, and now it was going to be priced beyond what they could afford to pay for it. So a lot of them did something which they could do in Ulster, which couldn't do in any other part of Ireland, which is they could actually auction off their leases to the highest bidder. So they would sell them on the market. They would call in an auctioneer, and they'd have an auction, and the neighbors would come, and they'd bid. They'd pay so much for an acre, and they would sell the land to the highest bidder and take off and come to America. So they came with some money. So this is what happened to my earliest ancestor, whose name was Rippy. And at this time, the state of Pennsylvania was anxious to thwart what they saw as Catholic intrusions from Maryland, Maryland being quite a Catholic colony. And so most of the occupants of inland Pennsylvania were Mennonites or Quakers, pacifist people. And so they made this whole settlement of Irish right along the border with Maryland because they figured the Scotch-Irish would fight for the land and they wouldn't allow the Catholics to infiltrate Pennsylvania. So that was the first big migration. The second there was a big interruption in the migrations around our Revolutionary War. Many of the fighters in the Revolutionary War were ancestors, your ancestors like this, who came for the exact same reason. Catholic immigration was smaller in those days because the Catholic community was so central to the culture of the Catholics. They had their Catholic churches and their whole way of doing things. There weren't Catholic churches in America. It was very much a Protestant country. So they tended to stay put. So no great immigration during the war. It started up again after the Revolution. But it wasn't so heavy then because Ireland had a period of great prosperity. The English were at war with the French. Ireland was a farming country, and the English needed their food desperately, so prices went up, and the Irish did very well. The rents went up as well, unfortunately. And when the war ended in 1815, the market for the farm goods they produced collapsed. The rents did not change, though. They were war rents that they had to pay. So this terrible period of depression settled over. Ireland became the very poor country that we think of. And so now you started to have another filter of people leaving Ireland. Now, I don't know if any of you have Irish that went to Canada. But as the emigrations built up, as it worked toward the time of the famine, there was a big difference in where people went because the cost of the passage was very different. So that it was much cheaper to go to Canada than it was to go to the United States because the United States didn't want all these sick, poor Irish flooding into the country. They were not desirable immigrants. And so they put regulations on the ships, which required the ships to have a doctor on board. You had to have sufficient food, sufficient water, so that the Irish immigrants coming to Boston and New York would come in reasonably good health. And that made the cost of the passage go up. So if your ancestors went to Canada, you can pretty much say they were the poorest of the poor, because everybody else would naturally flow to New York and Boston. So Ireland, all these years, from the time those first Scotch settlers came, was very much a hotbed of religious animosity, particularly in the north, where the populations were more equal and interacted. After the Act of Union, which I can talk about if you want to, but I won't go into, after the Act of Union, it was very much exacerbated, because Ireland was run by a minority of members of the Church of Ireland. So the population of Ireland at the time of the famine, after the Act of Union, was about 75% Catholic. Of the remaining 25, it was divided between Church of Ireland members and Presbyterians. The Catholics and the Presbyterians had to support the minority established government. The Church of Ireland was the favored church of the government. They were the same thing. And so people, no matter how their financial situation was and how much they wanted to support their own churches, had to pay tithes to the Church of Ireland. So the clergymen of the Church of Ireland would come along and confiscate 10% of everybody's crops. And then they would sell that, and that money would go to their church to pay off the obligations of these Presbyterians and the Catholics. And as you can imagine, the Catholics were not particularly happy to be forced to do things by this very small minority of people. And so there were endless problems, confrontations between Catholics and Protestants, and that took place most commonly in Ulster, where they mixed most commonly. So this is the background for my adventure. My family came from Ulster. They were the Presbyterian stock. So all of the people that I'm talking about in the book are Presbyterians. Okay, any questions so far? Okay. So as I don't get lost, here we go. Usually when I speak, one of my goals is to convince audiences that searching out their family history is one of the most wonderful adventures they will ever experience. And I know you know that already. And one of the most valuable uses of your time. But I know you know that. That said, I know you have had lectures recently planned to help you research grandparents that came from Canada and Scotland. My interest is Irish genealogy and Irish history, though I'm certainly no expert on either subject. As I tell you about my Irish adventures that led to my 2 books on Irish history, I'll include some information about the mistakes I made searching for more family data that hopefully will help you in any search you may undertake. First, however, I do want to emphasize one aspect of family history that you might not have thought about. Our thousands upon thousands of grandfathers and grandmothers made millions upon millions of choices over the centuries. Had any one of those choices been different, we would not exist. We are all truly miracles. We must show our appreciation for this great gift by making the most of our lives, and I'm sure you've done that, and passing on the stories of our lives to our grandchildren who will live centuries from now, who would otherwise never know us. We'd just be somebody's line on their family tree. I don't want that to happen. Only our stories will allow future historians to really understand the times we are living in. Having the stories of the rich and powerful isn't enough for future historians to discover what the early years of the 21st century were really like. They need to hear the stories of the lives of ordinary citizens as well. Our stories. I hope to convince some of you to head home and start writing or recording or whatever works for you. Today, I'm going to share with you some of the adventures that convinced me of the importance of both family history and writing our stories. I offer them as an example, knowing that you have even more important stories to tell. I was very lucky. I had 2 very special booklets, and I'm talking about little booklets like that, maybe 20 or 30 pages. You can crank them out now on a computer, but these were both published. That were left to me by 2 of my relatives. My grandfather, Reverend William Harshaw, wrote a biography of his father, Michael, who immigrated to America when he was a boy of 16. The other was an autobiography written by my mother's great aunt, Mary Jane Hill Anderson. One of the events in her life that Mary Jane wrote about was her departure from Ireland. She and her husband rose early. They lived in County Cavan, hoping to leave the family before the family was awake, thus avoiding the pain of a final embrace, a final farewell. However, her entire family arose early enough to experience the moment of separation. Her father, mother, and 5 sisters were at the gate. I have stood at that gate. The little girls sobbing out their anguish. Then Mary Jane and her husband climbed into a donkey cart and drove down the hill, leaving her home forever. She described clearly how painful it was to watch her family disappear from sight, knowing she would never see them again. When I was starting my study of Irish history, I found a book called Immigrants and Exile. Have any of you read that one? It's a very helpful book if you're trying to puzzle out why your ancestors came. It was written by Professor Kirby Miller. He's a professor at the University of Missouri. As I was reading the book, I came across an account of the trauma of leaving Ireland. Professor Miller had somehow found that small autobiography and used Mary Jane's account of her departure from Ireland that always moved me to tears. Though there was no attribution, I knew exactly where it came from. Having these 2 stories to read and reread is a priceless gift I must replicate. I'm working on that now. I'm not telling you to do something that I'm not trying to do myself. My first attempt to hunt for my unknown grandparents began on a hot and humid summer afternoon around 1980. I headed to the Ipswich Public Library with one of my daughters at a time when the smart residents of Ipswich were headed to Cranes Beach to cool off. Instead, we headed up the stairs that led to the history section in the balcony. Trying to ignore the stifling heat, we searched through the books on the shelves, looking for information on the Roby family. I was amazed to see how many wonderful tools we have in Ipswich and in Massachusetts to be successful in any search for grandparents. I learned just how much fun the search for ancestors would be. I started first with my husband Jean's family, since they had lived in America for several centuries. Always take the easy route first. Then I turned to my Irish family. I knew this search, mainly in Ireland, would be much more difficult, but I was lucky. Again, I had a unique last name, and you must admit, Harshaw is not your ordinary common Irish last name. It's because it came originally from England. I also had several documents to work from. Besides my grandfather's booklet, I had a green book. It's about this big. A history of the parish of Donegal, which had been written by a clergyman, J. Davison Cowans, over 100 years earlier. Now, a small digression. This book was always on my father's bookshelf. So when after my mother died and we had to move my father to a smaller house, you know the drill, we had to go through my father's things and decide what to take and what to keep and you or dispose of, and you can't do that easily. So I remember distinctly standing in the center of the living room floor with that book in my hand and saying, do I keep it or do I throw it away? You want to guess what I decided to do? That would have been smart, keep it. I said, no, we'll throw it away. Bad idea. I had to pay dearly to replace it later on. Keep your precious things. When you have to make these hard decisions, keep the precious things, the pictures, anything that's written, any letters that's written, keep them. Anyway, the reason this book was interesting to me, it was always on the shelves as we moved from Maryland to Massachusetts. My grandfather's name was in it. I thought it was very neat to have somebody I actually knew mentioned in a book. The Donegal history also contained some information about earlier Harshaw grandfathers, so I could trace at least theoretically, my grandfather's path back, as well as the existence of diaries that had been written by a relative, James Harshaw, an Irish farmer. Searching for family history can be very daunting and too often fruitless. I know you know that. Potentially, my searching had been made very easy. All I had to do was find the diaries. In 1992, my husband and I began to plan our first trip to Ireland. I set aside time to search for the diaries in the Public Record Office in Belfast, where I expected to find them. But something important happened first. My son Steve had decided it was time for Mom to join the modern world. He was upgrading his computer, so he sent me his old one. Knowing I was working on Harshaw family history, he also printed out all the Harshaws listed in the U.S. phone books. There was a surprisingly large number of them. So I picked out some that I thought might be the most helpful. I wrote a form letter, which you could do on a computer, asking for information about family histories and whether or not the recipient knew anything about the Harshaw diaries. Then I printed them out on my new printer, addressed and stamped the envelopes, and finally slid them through the outgoing mail slot in the Ipswich Public Post Office and waited for results. A substantial number of them were returned for having an out-of-date address or addressees unknown. I know you've had that happen. But some Harshaws responded with interesting information about their own family histories. I also received a phone call from a woman who had surprising news. You know some of the Harshaws are black. I most certainly didn't know that. But having lived under Jim Crow laws as I grew up, I immediately realized this new information that some early Harshaws had owned slaves. But none of them who took time to respond knew anything about my Harshaw families or the Harshaw diaries. I tried unsuccessfully not to feel disappointed. Everything changed one Friday afternoon about supper time with a single phone call. When I answered, an unfamiliar voice responded, "Hello, you don't know me. I'm Karen Hickey. I'm a cousin. I live in Keokuk, Iowa. I have the Harshaw diaries." I can promise you, I would never have looked for them there. I was stunned at the news. Karen went on to explain how she came to have them. She had a grandfather whose name was James Harshaw. The Harshaws love to recycle names, which also happened to be the name of the man who wrote the Diaries. She had a letter her James had once written from a town in western Pennsylvania. So she did something I always recommend. She called the nearest public library to ask if there were Harshaws still living there. The librarian was very helpful, as they always are. She told Karen that there were no Harshaws living in the area, but there was a Harshaw real estate company in the town of Grove City, which wasn't too far away. The librarian gave Karen the phone number, and Karen followed up with a call. She reached Sally Harshaw Lowing, and after identifying herself, Karen asked Sally if she knew anything about James Harshaw. As it happened, Sally had the 6 diaries in her desk drawer. Thinking the writer of the diaries was the ancestor Karen was looking for, Sally sent the diaries to Karen in Keokuk. Karen became the first person to read the diaries in many decades. When Jean and I flew to Ireland a few weeks later, I still intended to search for family information. We set aside to look for Lochgilly in County Armagh, the place my Michael had left to come to America. But I had made a bad mistake. I came to Ireland with the expectation that research in Ireland was the same as in New England, with even more extensive records, because Ireland was a much older country. I expected to find Lochgilly crossroads or perhaps a small village, too small to appear on my Irish map. We stopped in Mount Norris, which did appear on my map, and found a small shop where I could ask directions to Lochgilly. Go back down the hill and take the first left, I was instructed. All that was on that road was a small housing estate that was obviously built within the last few decades. There was no sign of small cottages or farms or signs of Lochgilly, nothing. Any of you have searched for family in Ireland understand that the key to finding where ancestors lived was finding the name of the townland they came from. Have you experienced that? Lochgilly was a parish, not a townland. Even some basic research would have prevented such a dumb mistake. I found the truth when I did a bit of research later in the Public Record Office in Belfast. It was there I learned that I needed to know the name of the townland in which Michael lived. That was information I did not have. My Lochgilly search was a total failure, so I was very disappointed when we headed north to Belfast. Along the way, we drove near the small town of Points Pass, which is in County Armagh, where I knew a Harshaw lived, and diverted in hopes we could contact him. Perhaps he could help me find Lochgilly. We found the proper house without difficulty. I knocked on the door, got no answer. Another disappointment. I was turning away when a car pulled up in front of the house, and an older man got out. Seeing a stranger on his doorstep, he asked, "Can I help you?" I pulled a photo of my Michael Harshaw out of my coat pocket, the photo that had appeared in my grandfather's little biography. I held it out to Hugh and explained that I was the great-granddaughter of the man in the photo. To my surprise, he responded, "Ah, I know." Hugh invited us into his parlor. When we were settled, he produced a photocopy of my grandfather's book. He didn't indeed know what I was talking about, for my grandfather's book had somehow made its way to a town near where Michael was born. Then Hugh pulled a book from a cabinet, a green book that looked distinctly familiar. He showed me the page that mentioned James Harshaw's diaries. James was my great-grandfather, Hugh told me. Apparently, he and his brother James had hunted for the diaries all their lives without success. It was my great blessing, to watch the joy spread over Hugh's face when I told him, "Hugh, I know where they are." I knew at that wonderful moment I would have to do everything in my power to bring the diaries home to Hugh and his brothers, home to Ireland. When I got back to Ipswich, I called Karen and told her what had happened. She sent the diaries to me, concerned that there was nothing to back up the information in them. If her house burned down, they would be gone. They were 6 large volumes. You think of diaries as being these little things that you write 2 or 3 lines. These are like this. Bound in dark red or maroon covers, bearing the words, "The Diary of James Harshaw, Donegal." Printed in gold letters on each volume. Now, you know these cost a pretty penny. Each page was handwritten at a time when writing required ink. I wrote originally quill pens, but they had actually at that time started having what they called dip pens. They was an improvement over quill pens, and I suspect that James wrote with those. The handwriting that resulted was rather primitive, without punctuation or proper spelling. He was, after all, an Irish farmer. After I became the second person to read them, I shared Karen's belief that the books were exceedingly important historical documents. The information they contained needed to be backed up somehow. Unfortunately, there was no mention anywhere in any volume of my branch of the Harshaw family, so my search would have to continue. I had been a member of the New England Historical and Genealogical Society. Any members here? Yes. For a number of years. So I decided to seek input and assistance from them. I made a photocopy of one of the pages and headed to Negg's on Newbury Street in Boston. I showed my copy page to the man at the desk while I explained that this was one page of a 6-volume set. He paged Scott Bartley, who was the head of the manuscript section. Maybe some of you have met him. He's no longer there. Scott was indeed interested and asked me to bring back one of the books. I did as requested. I was pleased that he agreed with Karen's and my assessments as to the importance of the diaries. He asked that I donate them to the society. I knew I couldn't do that. But Scott then offered to have the books microfilmed by the society instead. The contents of the diaries would be preserved. So any of you who are members, you can go in there, and the photocopies of the diaries are right there in his handwriting as he wrote them. When the job was done, I retrieved the books and asked Scott what I should do next. Go home and transcribe them, he advised. So that's what I did. My husband Gene rigged up a large book stand, and I began typing the contents into my computer. These transcriptions that I made are now the only ones that are used at the Public Record Office in Belfast. My typos included. When I finished in November of 1996, I put the books in my carry-on and I brought them home to Ireland. From the evidence available, I believe the diaries were sent to America in 1896. So they had been in America almost exactly 100 years. I had made the arrangements to donate the actual books to the Public Record Office, where I knew they would be safe in proper climate-controlled storage. I did make the stipulation that they would have to go first to Donegal for Hugh and his brothers to read. I knew Hugh would never go to the Public Record Office to read them. He wanted to sit by his fire in the winter and read them, and that's what they did. While they were being read in Donegal, I borrowed one of them to take to Belfast to show the historian who was managing the donation just what was involved. We introduced ourselves, and David Huddleston, who was the historian, directed me to a table to wait while a film crew set up to record the event. I watched for David's reaction as he leafed through the pages for the first time. He was clearly surprised by what he was seeing. Then I asked him the question I had been yearning to ask. Do you have any other records like these? David explained that most Irish farmers were illiterate, and those who wrote about their lives wrote briefly. Then he told me, "This is an Irish treasure." And indeed, the books are treated that way. When there is a request for a loan of a copy for an exhibit, a security team is sent to the venue to ensure safety. There was such intense interest in them by researchers that their condition began to deteriorate. Now, anyone desiring to use them must get special permission from Prony historians. So if you're ever in Prony, ask a historian and say Marjorie Harshaw Robie sent. They still remember that I donated them there. And they'll let you see them. After the filming was finished, David had a surprise for me. He handed me a roll of microfilm, which was part of their collection. The last entries in the Harshaw Diaries had been for the year 1865. I knew that James had lived for more than a year longer. On the roll of film were the remaining diary pages that had been written after the 6th volume had been bound. There was something else on the film that immediately had tears running down my cheeks. James's son Andrew had written a moving account of James's last illness in wonderful detail, right down to the last words James spoke. This was another wonderful gift, somebody who lived long ago writing his story for us to find. David gave me a copy of that film, which I transcribed into the 7th volume of the Diaries. The amazing events of this day hadn't ended. My interview with reporter Ivan Little of UTV had been incorporated into a 5-minute segment on the evening news. I watched it from my bed and breakfast in Bambridge, which was my home base at that time in Ireland. It's a little stunning to be from here and see you appear on an Irish TV program. The news had just ended when the phone rang. An elderly farmer, Hedley Hillis, was calling, having seen the film on TV. He insisted that I come immediately to his house, which wasn't too far away. Hugh Fleming, whose wife ran the bed and breakfast, told me he would happily take me there. So I met Hedley Hillis. He had a visitor with him, Richard Harshaw. The reason for the imperative nature of his call. Richard had some photocopies of documents he had gotten from a John Harshaw who lived in Pennsylvania that supposedly provided information on my side of the family. The American Harshaw had linked up with the Irish Harshaw through a love of surfing. None of the information Richard had was new to me except the contact with a different Harshaw. I was able to contact John when I got home, and he sent me a packet of information that contained documents I hadn't seen before. One of the items was a photocopy of an obituary of Michael's brother Andrew. It stated that Andrew was born in Ballydocherty. I had the needed townland information at last. And I learned another valuable hint for successful family searches. Now I always check out all the family members when I'm trying to work through a roadblock. My adventures didn't end there, or my education about the complexities of searching for families in Ireland either. I had spent many hours wandering around the cemeteries of New England hunting Roby family information. I expected that I would get a lot of helpful information doing the same in Ireland. Those of you who have been hunting for gravestones in Ireland know that wasn't true either. Another mistake. Most ordinary Irish farmers had no money for anything as extravagant as a tombstone. Despite prolonged searching, I never found a tombstone for any of my ancestors. There were a few Harshaw grave markers in the southern parts of County Down and County Armagh, but none for my family or James Harshaw. One of the sad events in the diaries was James' account of the death of his eldest daughter, Mary. He described her death and funeral down to the path the cortege took to the burial ground. The Harshaw brothers followed the directions in the diary and arrived at the Glasgow Church and its cemetery. It was the only Presbyterian cemetery in the area, Perhaps the reason James had picked out a site there to bury the 2 children who had died previously, and then Mary. Fortunately, the Glasgow Church had records of the sites and could point out where James was actually buried. Brothers Hugh and James Harshaw kept a surprise for my next visit. Without telling me where we were headed, James drove to the cemetery and pointed out the site. We immediately decided we must now put up a stone to mark James's grave. So, after a fundraising effort in both America and Ireland, James picked out the granite and a design suitable for the time James died. So, it looked like James would have put it up, or his family. Hugh suggested a fitting epitaph, "A noble man." The following March, we had a family gathering to dedicate the tombstone. It was a sunny day, but quite brisk when we entered the church for a brief service conducted by the Reverend Clark, who was minister of the church. There was a grand turnout. Sally Harshaw Lowing was there with her husband and 3 sisters. We had a few hours together, and then they went on to see other things. It was the only time I ever met Sally Harshaw Lowing, because she died not long after. Karen Hickey was there. I met her for the first time, as was another American cousin, Suzanne Ballard, and her husband and son. Suzanne has a lovely singing voice and sang Amazing Grace as part of the service. David Huddleston had come down from Belfast as well. All the local Harshaw relatives, my new cousins that I had come to know, were there as well. The ladies of the congregation provided tea when the ceremony was over. It was a memorable day. Despite all the advantages I had, there was still one Irish great-grandmother about whom I knew nothing beyond the records commonly available in America. My grandfather hadn't added any information about his mother or her family in his biography, though I'm sure he could have easily provided the information I so desperately wanted had I thought to ask when he was alive. I'm sure you've had that experience as well. As I began to seriously study Irish genealogy, I came across another clue that is sometimes helpful for descendants of Irish families living in the middle part of the 19th century, especially helpful for families who fled the famine, because the better records exist for after the famine. You can get into Griffiths Valuation, and that's a very helpful thing. There isn't so much available to help out with earlier research. Records for this time period are decidedly lacking. However, these immigrant families often followed specific naming patterns. Have you ever worked through that? It's very helpful. The firstborn son was named for the baby's paternal grandfather. The firstborn daughter was named for the maternal grandmother. So the opposite ends of the spectrum there. The second-born son was named for the mother's father. The second-born daughter for the father's mother. The next children were supposedly named for the parents, but sometimes that was skipped because of the duplication of names. I applied this idea to my problem family. Michael married another Irish immigrant, Margaret McCluskey. Margaret had come as a young child with her mother, who was already a widow. After Margaret married Michael Harshaw, her mother, also Margaret McCluskey, moved with the young couple to their final destination, Perry County in southern Illinois. And may I just say that they should have moved to Massachusetts. Southern Illinois in this time frame did not keep good records. Margaret and Michael's first child was a daughter named Sarah. This was the name of Michael's mother, perhaps so named because Margaret's mother was not only alive but living with them, and this would have been the third Margaret. Grandparents would be honored anyway in this first child, though not exactly following the formula. The second child was also a daughter, whom they named Elizabeth Margaret. This way they could tuck in the Margaret without duplication. So I was still sort of hopeful. The third child was a son. In this case, the naming pattern was working well. Michael's father was indeed Andrew, which they named the new baby. Even better, his mother's maiden name was Henry, and so the child was named Andrew Henry. Perhaps this would work out on the mother's side, which was where my problems were. The fourth child was a son they named Thomas G. There are no birth records to find out what that G stands for. And sadly, Thomas G only lived a year or so, so that there's no way to trace him. Now, if Margaret and Michael remembered Margaret's parents in the same way they had Michael's, it would mean that Margaret's father was Thomas and that his wife's maiden name began with the letter G. Certainly, I knew the name Thomas never appeared in any Harshaw family, which was notorious for recycling names. I know that drives you crazy, too. At least a clue to explore. I had one other bit of helpful information. When my sister and I were moving my father to a smaller house closer to where we lived, I was going through an old chest. In it, I found an old picture of a church that appeared to have been taken late in the 19th century, along with two similarly tinted pictures of the same house. On the back of the church photo, my father had written that this was the church where Margaret McCloskey Harshaw had been baptized. The two houses showed different views of the house where Margaret had been born. I had something concrete to look for since I struck out with the tombstones. My family were all Presbyterian, so I began visiting County Down Presbyterian churches. Jean and I got lost on many back roads without finding any church that looked remotely like the one in the photo. We feared that the church had been renovated beyond recognition. However, my luck finally began to change. In 2004, I was on a very special tour of Belfast, arranged by a skilled researcher named Maud Hamill. I chanced to sit next to Maud at dinner in Belfast Castle and mentioned my fruitless church search. Maud asked to see the photocopy I had made of the picture. She generously offered to find the church for me. Thus began a very special friendship. After I returned to Massachusetts, Maud would from time to time search for Presbyterian churches in County Down. Finally, I got a message from her that she'd come to think perhaps the McCloskeys had come from County Antrim instead of County Down, where my mother had said she was born. Maud would reorient her searching. She made several trips into Antrim, into farm areas, without success. One day, there was a brief break in the rainy weather, during which she thought there might be enough time to search for one church she had yet to visit. This church was located along a stream below the level of the road and partially hidden by a row of trees. She missed it on her first pass and had to retrace her route. Turning off the main road and driving down a driveway, she was facing the Kelswater Covenanting Presbyterian Church, the exact church in my picture. Very little changed over a century. This was the oldest Covenanting church in that part of Ireland, maybe Northern Ireland, maybe the oldest one still existing. I've since had a chance to visit and go inside. My incorrect information that had plagued my townland search had now sent me on a wild goose chase in the wrong county. Skepticism and willingness to cast a wide net are good tools for Irish research. Everything is not as it appears. There was another important lesson for researchers in this experience. I cannot stress enough the necessity to settle in areas where your ancestors might have come from long enough to meet up with the local people who are very knowledgeable and interested in local history and local families. Like Maud, they may help researchers jump perplexing hurdles. So give it a try, it's a lot of fun. Researching general history is a good way to connect with the lives of our historic families when all else fails. Once the diary adventures were over, I had to acknowledge that I was as ignorant about Irish history as I was about effective searching for Irish ancestors. I had read most of the Irish histories in Ipswich Library, as well as some I had purchased on my own. But these were all books that looked backward in time and lacked the specific information we get in our local histories and personal stories in New England. For the first time, I thought perhaps I should write a book based on the information in the diaries. The diaries began with sporadic entries about 1834 and ended in 1865. So it includes the famine. Interesting things about the famine. James was born around 1797 to James Harshaw and Mary Bradford. He married very young, a local farm girl named Sarah Kidd. Early marriages were common, whom James lovingly nicknamed the Dandy. They had 12 children, 10 of whom lived to be adults, 7 sons and 3 daughters. James and Sarah have many living descendants, some of whom live close to the Harshaw house, which is still standing in the townland of Ringban in County Down. Others live in the United States and Australia. Some of them are still missing, and I'm hunting in the US. One of the Harshaw daughters gave up her nice, easy-to-find name and married a Smith. I always look at finding a Smith on a family tree as sure evidence I did something very wrong in a previous life. The diaries contained a lot of farm information about the fields James leased, what he raised, the prices he got for his crops, and whom he hired to work his fields. So if your Irish ancestors were farmers, the diaries tell you exactly what their lives were like. Like most Irish farmers, he didn't own any land or even his own home. He leased his holdings from the actual owner. Therefore, he was forever vulnerable to the danger that the actual owner would eject him from his farm and leave him homeless in the lane with his possessions heaped around them. Many of you may have found this kind of a story in your lives as well. James never faced that, though he faced great financial hardships. However, his son John inherited, he was the oldest surviving son, inherited management of the family property, and he was ejected from his house and had all of the possessions that had belonged to James and his family for over a century dumped on the street in front of their house. James was a fine example of a good citizen. He helped his poor neighbors survive the deadly Irish famine, helped establish a dispensary to provide them some medical care. He was an elder in the Donegal Presbyterian Church. He visited the sick, wrote wills, helped fund and build a local school, and a manse for the minister of his church. In his diaries, he recorded the names of many of his neighbors as they emigrated to Canada or the United States. So there's a small little chance that if you're missing an ancestor, that the name will actually appear in the diaries. Some of them do. One of the people James mentioned often in his diaries was his nephew, John Martin, who was born in 1812, the son of Samuel Martin and James's sister, Jane. The Martins lived just across the lane from the Harshaw house in the townland of Loughorn. The Martin family actually owned the townland. John was destined to manage the land while younger brothers managed the family linen mills. Now, I'll divert to another little story, which some of you may find perplexing. John Martin's father, Samuel, was one of 3 brothers. And the 3 brothers had amassed quite a bit of money to get their linen mills and to own the townland. One thing they didn't bother to do was get married. So when the brothers had sort of reached an advanced age, they began to notice they didn't have anybody to leave the things that they had earned to. Somebody would have to get married. Well, none of the brothers were actually wild to make this sacrifice. So they did what probably made good sense. They drew straws. This was all mentioned in documentation. I didn't make any of this up. So they drew straws. Samuel obviously lost. Samuel was the oldest of the brothers. He was 61 years old. So he went across the street to the Harshaw house to his friend James to arrange to marry James's sister Jane, who was 23. And so this was an agreed to marriage. Jane married Samuel. They had 7 children before Samuel died. So you will find this from time to time, and often you will find on Irish records that the fathers die young or die leaving a widow and young family. And this is part of the reason why some of them just simply did not marry until late in life. So another thing to look for. So anyway, Jane did her duty and had the 7 children. John Martin was the second of their children. For the first years of his life, John was a farmer. He was educated, though. He was sent to good schools. He went to Trinity College in Dublin. But he was a farmer, often working with his uncle Harshaw. That all changed when the famine struck Ireland in 1845. John reported that the horrors of that event seared his soul and propelled him into political action. He never returned to farming. His name appeared briefly in some Irish history books. Have any of you ever heard of John Martin? Have any of you heard of John Mitchell? John Martin was John Mitchell's friend. Okay? And in fact, John Martin later married John Mitchell's sister. But when John got involved in politics, his political beliefs were very contrary to most of the Scotch-Irish in Ulster. He was a nationalist. He supported the Catholic majority desire to be independent from England. It got him into trouble because first off, he joined Daniel O'Connell's. Maybe some of you, I know you've heard of Daniel O'Connell. He joined Daniel O'Connell's Repeal Association. That was his first introduction. Then he was part of the group that splintered off from them, the Young Islanders, who you might have heard of. Anyway, to make a long story short, the English didn't like what he was writing in his newspaper. And they did the same thing to him that they had done previously to John Mitchell. They had passed a law that made writing things that tended to put the English government in disrepute to be a crime of felony treason. And it allowed juries to send you off to exile and confiscate everything that you owned. So after this happened to John Mitchell, John Martin jumped into the breach, and the same thing happened to him. His newspaper was closed. He was charged with felony treason. He was tried in court in Dublin before a jury that was carefully arranged to have only enemies on it. Easier to get a conviction that way. He was convicted, and he was sent off to what was called Van Diemen's Land. It's now Tasmania. It's an island south of Australia. You couldn't get farther away from Ireland than they sent John Martin. So this is the place where the second book begins. The trial and all of that's in the first book. But in the second book, John Martin is nearing his period of exile in Australia. Anyway, so that was John Martin's political career. But it wasn't over. He came back and undaunted, joined the political fray again, fighting always for independence for Ireland and respect for the Catholic population, which didn't endear him to his neighbors. He was known throughout his life. He left a very extensive written record, which I was able to dig up. Letters that he wrote, speeches that he gave were covered in the newspapers. He was known through his life as Honest John Martin. He was a political leader with principles. He always entered debates with the recognition that he might be wrong. That required him to listen carefully to those who held different ideas. Political progress was only possible if politicians respected opponents and were willing to compromise their different beliefs. He also believed it was wrong to profit from public service. The more I read, the more I was convinced that this was a man too important to remain essentially forgotten. I realized that I had two cousins, two writers, whose words and lives of achievement needed to be rescued from oblivion. They revealed much detail that gave a unique and important perspective on Irish history as it unfolded, not looked back on and analyzed from afar. There were two problems remaining before I could start writing their stories. John and James had different political opinions than most of the Protestants of Ireland. While James and John wanted Ireland to be an independent country, free from English control, most Protestants wanting to cling tightly to their union with England. I needed to find someone to express the loyalist point of view before I could think of publishing what I had so far learned. I also recognized that I knew far too little about the history of 19th century Ireland. However, I remembered that there was a local newspaper, the Newry Commercial Telegraph, which both James and John read. Fortunately, I discovered the paper had been filmed and the films were available for purchase from the British Library in London. So I bought a second-hand microfilm reader and proceeded to buy the films one by one. You can now buy, they're available online. You don't have to do any of this business. This paper was published 3 times a week, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturday, was 4 pages long, 6 columns wide. It began with advertisements on the first page and ended with stories and poems on page 4, with most of the news I was interested in the middle. I focused my note-taking there. When I finished, I had read every edition of the newspaper from 1828 to 1875. Now I knew quite a lot about Irish history. I hadn't gotten very far into the newspaper project before I encountered George Henderson, who was the editor of the paper. He was born in Newry in 1814, so he's 2 years younger than John Martin, the son of James Henderson and Amelia McGill. He became editor of the Telegraph because his older brother, James, owned it. George and the paper supported the Conservative Party and the connections between Ireland and England. I was thrilled to discover that George was a classmate of John's at Dr. Henderson's classical school in Newry and was a good friend of John's, despite their different politics. I knew then that I had found just the right person to allow me to provide a complete accounting of the history and politics of Ireland that I had previously lacked. George wrote the editorials, leaders as they were called in Ireland. He proved to be a skilled and very partisan writer. Unfortunately, George had a very tragic personal life. His first wife died when she was still young, as did each of their 4 children. He married a second time and again had 4 children. This time, 2 sons survived to adulthood. Though one son, James, married, he had no children. So George, like John, had no family to tell his story and keep his memory alive. I felt an intense obligation to remedy this situation. While George was a usually very partisan writer, he occasionally wrote a sentence that stood out from the rest of his writings as though he had experienced a moment of epiphany. I had worked my way to 1843 when one morning I discovered one of these special sentences. And I'll read it slowly because it's something that might ring bells here. It is the curse of party, he means political party, that it sees no light in an opponent or shadow in an ally. It blinds the understanding and de-Christianizes the heart. It is the curse of party that it sees no light in an opponent or shadow in an ally. It blinds the understanding and de-Christianizes the heart. I read those words just as the first plane hit the first tower on 9/11. It was as though George had recognized the dangers of tribalism that infest hearts and minds both here and in Ireland today. Now, I knew I was ready to start a book project that would tell the stories of the lives of these three forgotten men who lived so long ago. As I started to weave the writings together to allow the history of Ireland to unfold as my three co-authors lived it, I realized that I had more material than I could cram into a single book. So I wrote a book that held only the first part of the story. Dueling Dragons began in the year 1830 with a previously unknown effort to achieve religious peace in that part of Ireland. They actually held a peace conference in Newry in 1830, all religions coming together, pledging to be peaceful co-inhabitants of the land, doing away with all the religious animosity. It ended in 1849, first book, with a dreadful attack by Protestant Orangemen on the Catholic village of Dolly's Bray. Peace efforts had clearly failed. Has anybody ever heard of the Battle of Dolly's Bray? Okay, it's the last event in the first book. It was a terrible attack on Marching Day, July 12th. Every July 12th is the day the Orangemen march. And back in those days, the marches were very much an effort to coerce the Catholic population. And so rather than take the direct route from their gathering, they went on a roundabout route so that they could go through the little village, Catholic village of Dolly's Bray. The attack was fierce. The Orangemen damaged the houses. They attacked an elderly woman in her house and beat her to death. They killed an imbecile, a mentally deficient villager who was trailing along behind them. They shot a 10-year-old boy. It was a big deal, even for them. It won't be a shock to you to know that when the trials of the accused were held, nobody was found guilty. That was not anything unusual either. But I'll divert to another little story. I introduced you to Hugh Fleming, who ran the bed and breakfast. Well, Dolly's Bray is not far from the bed and breakfast that I stayed in. And I had read all the reports about it, so I knew quite a bit about it. And I asked Hugh if he would drive me over there, and he did. And so we were driving around Dolly's Bray, and I'm pointing out where the Orangemen were stationed, where the Catholics tried to fight back and so forth. And then I noticed he was looking at me peculiarly, and I said, "What's wrong?" He said, "It's really strange to be taught Irish history by an American lady." Anyway, that was Dolly's Bray. So the next book begins just where that ended up, with the aftermath of Dolly's Bray, and with John Martin nearing his time in exile in Van Diemen's Land. And the second book ends when the last of my three writers stopped writing. And that was the death of John Martin. the last thing he did was to write a letter to a friend after his friend John Mitchell, whom we talked about before, had died. The two friends died 10 days apart in the same house in Newry. And so the two men were buried very close in time. So the last letter that John Martin wrote was the last thing that I could write, except for all the newspaper reports of the funeral. After I finished these books and settled down, the first book, and settled down to actually write the second book, which I just finished this summer, I noticed something very strange, that the topics that were so important and controversial then seem very like the issues that are divisive in America today. They struggled with voting and voting rights, taxes, free trade and tariffs, guns, education, religious conflicts, health care, freedom of the press, growing democracy. In Ireland, these divisive issues led to a century of civil war. The most recent outbreak, the Troubles, lasted 30 years and cost the lives of over 3,000 people. Two of them, James Harshaw's direct descendants. Aubrey Harshaw was killed by an IRA bomb in a Newry pub. Robert Bradford was assassinated by an IRA hit squad in Belfast. He was a member of Parliament at the time. Hopefully, the words of these three men who lived so long ago can provide some insight for people struggling to confront these same complicated issues today. Histories in general, and primary source materials in particular, like these two histories of Ireland, are very helpful in recreating stories of grandparents from Ireland who left no records or stories. The outflow of Irish refugees began when depression settled over the island after the end of the lengthy French and English War. This was a time of great distress. Farm prices fell while rents remained unrealistically high. General histories of this gloomy period can easily be attached to specific grandparents. For example, there are descriptions of the horrors of the Atlantic crossing. These dangers afflicted most immigrants. The dangers of storms at sea, hunger, and sickness described in the histories are exactly the same hazards your grandparents experienced and can provide detail of what happened between the time they watched Ireland disappear and flocks of birds darting around the masts and sails alerted passengers that their new home was just over the horizon. If you have ancestors who came from Ireland, these dragon books can be most helpful. Of all the people who left Ireland and came to America between the years 1820 and 2004, half of them left during the time period covered by these books. They made clear what was happening in Ireland that propelled grandparents to risk the ocean trip that brought them to America. This information can be added to your family stories. There is one new hope for those who have tried every possible approach to finding the home place of their Irish ancestors: DNA testing. Have any of you had DNA testing done? Good, lots of you. While this technique is just in its early stages, as time passes, more people in Ireland do the testing. You may get matches to the specific places and families in Ireland that you may not have now. My oldest son is very interested in this new source of information on family history. So with his help and the help of Harshaw cousins in Ireland, we tested male descendants for all branches of the Harshaw family that we know of. So we can, any Harshaw that turns up in America, we can attach you to the place that your family came from if you don't know it at the moment. Now we know all the Harshaws aren't part of the same family. Rare name that it is. They're not the same family. We know that my great-grandfather Michael was closely related to James Harshaw, who wrote the Diaries, In this case, family stories were proven accurate by science. Hopefully, I have at least tempted some of you to go home and start writing your stories. As a writer, I have 2 suggestions to make your stories compelling. Include as much detail as you can remember. For example, my grandfather wrote that his father would assemble the children of his church during the interval between morning and afternoon services and amuse them with his wonderful Irish stories. That's nice to know, but I wish Grandfather had included just one of those Irish stories in his book. Don't be satisfied with general if you can be specific. Also, provide as much information as you can about people who were special to you along the way, who may have died without writing their stories, or who have left family members to write them later. I'm going to close with an example of the importance of providing a form of immortality to people who would otherwise be forgotten. I am finishing my writing career by writing my own stories, so I am practicing what I am preaching. And I'm going to share with you one of the stories that's going into my personal autobiography. It has nothing to do with Ireland or my books. But if I don't tell this story, no one will ever know about Jerry Grantham or that he lived at all. I am the only one who can tell his story. Now, Jerry Grantham, I met on the first day of school, I think in about 1987. I was teaching 6th grade English in Ipswich, Massachusetts. And I always stood at the door as the new students came in on the first day of school to welcome them. And this very small, dark-haired, dark-eyed Jerry Grantham appeared in the door and walked right up into my space in front of me. And he looked up at me and he said, "I drove my teacher up the wall last year, and I'm going to do the same for you." I told him, "I don't think so, Jerry. I'm not really very good at climbing." But the first day of class convinced me that he was determined to carry out his boast. So we sort of arranged an afternoon date. And to my surprise, he actually came. So I learned a little bit about him. He came from a family where he was not wanted, a family that really not a family at all. He was too expensive for them to afford. His father was non-existent. His mother was on welfare. His older brother was in MCI Walpole. So this was one of those throwaway kids who had nobody looking out for him. And I felt badly for him. That didn't make any difference. The second day was a repeat of the first one. He wouldn't do any work. He was endlessly disruptive and was beginning to drive me slightly crazy. But we met again after school, and I explained to him what I expected of him. I had him parked right in front of my desk. He couldn't move a muscle without my seeing it. So I kept my eye on him. Second day, he came again. Nothing much happened. Third day was a repeat of the first and the second. And he came again after school. I was not going to let this little kid drive me up any wall. And so I said to him after school, "Jerry, the 6th grade is starting a football team. You've got a lot of excess energy. Why don't you go out and play football?" And he looked at me and he said, "Are you crazy? I'd get killed out there." And he was very small. And I said to him, "I'm sorry, Jerry, I don't think of you that way." And that was the breakthrough. And Jerry began doing work for me. And I discovered right away why he didn't want to write anything, which is what we were supposed to be teaching him, because he had very little literacy at all. He couldn't spell, he couldn't do any punctuation, but he was wonderfully creative. The content of what he wrote was amazingly insightful and showed a great talent there. He was also enormously funny. He had an impeccable sense of timing and intonation. So he got along all right with the kids. As you can imagine, he kept some of them entertained. And I'll just tell you one of the stories of Jerry's talent. I had another student in that same class, I'll call Bob, who was undergoing a total mental breakdown. I kept him far in the back of the room, as far as away from Jerry as I could keep him. And he had a tendency to cry. Everything caused him to cry. He had a church-going family, a mother and a father who cared about him, but we could not convince him that this boy was mentally ill and needed help. On this particular afternoon, after lunch, for some reason or another, Bob was particularly agitated. So he was sitting in the back of the room, not tears going down his cheeks. He was sobbing loudly, sobs all over the room. Jerry got up from his front seat, looked back over the crowd, and he said, impeccably delivered line, "Women and children to the lifeboats first." At that moment, the class erupted in laughter, including me, and the principal walked through the door. And here we didn't even, there was no way we were going to stop laughing. It was just so funny. And he stood at the door for a little while, and then he turned around and walked out without saying a word. So I had to make a bargain with Jerry that I would not copy any of the work that he did, and I would give everything back to him. And I kept my promise, though I wish over and over again I had not done so. We made a deal. I couldn't grade him on his command of the English language because he had none. So automatically he was going to fail in that. But I could give him grades on creativity, which was outstanding, and I could grade him on whatever grammatical issue we were working on to see that he had included that, and his writing was actually improving, and that was working out fine. So he's actually going to pass. I mean, he isn't an A-level student, but he's going to pass. And then one day he was gone. And I went down to the office to find out what had happened to Jerry, and he was never absent. And they said that his mother had moved and he had transferred to a different school in Salem. And I was really crushed because I knew by that time that if I'd had a year with Jerry, and if he had stayed in school for a while, he had talents that were very marketable, and he would be a very successful human being. But we did not have that time. About 4 or 5 months later, I was in my class, and I hear a little knock on the door. And I opened the door, and there was Jerry. He had skipped school in Salem, where he had moved, hitched a ride back to Ipswich somehow to sort of say goodbye to me. He said he hated school. He wanted to come back to Ipswich. He was miserable. So I tried to buck him up. I said, "Jerry, you have an extreme talent here. Use it. You're funny. You have all the basics for being a very prominent person. You have the creativity. You have the delivery skills. I practice them. Watch comedians on TV. You tell your jokes. Write your little stories and tell them to people. And that way you will start to build a future for yourself." And then I said to him, "Jerry, I expect someday that I'm going to see you headlining a comedy show at a club or on TV. And I expect to get in free." And he looked at me with this twinkle in his eye, and he said, "No, you'll have to pay like everybody else." And with that, he turned and scurried back down the steps. Well, you've never heard the name Jerry Grantham? He was never a famous comedian. He found an escape for his misery in the drug scene in Salem. He got into drugs. He was arrested by the police and put into Salem jail. and he found a way to escape from Salem jail. He figured out how to create a noose, and he hanged himself in Salem jail. He was 16 years old. Now, I can make sure that people do not forget the story of Jerry Grantham, and I intend to do that. And I know you have met along your way people that have been very important to you that you want to remember as well. And so I encourage you when you're writing your stories about your family to include those as well. Maiden aunts who didn't write about their lives, people that were especially helpful to you and important to you along the way. Include them in what you write. It's so important. With modern technology, it's so easy to do. You can just talk into your iPhone if you want to do the easy route. But I encourage you all to do this because together we can be creating a wonderful history and letting everybody know, these times, hard as they may be, are filled with wonderful people. And we will leave our stories of our lives to our grandchildren and to future historians for centuries to come. So my challenge, get to work. Now, I thank you all for listening so patiently. Goodness gracious, I've rattled on for a long time. Now, if you have any questions, we still have a little time for questions and answers. Thank you so much.
I'm interested in how where you find these old English newspaper files online.
Today? If the question was how you can find newspapers online today.
Well, the old ones like an island, regarding Ireland, that's what I'm interested in.
There is a website. It's a pay one. It's called British Newspaper Archive. Some of you have found it, I see. It's a subscription one. It has loads of newspapers. It has all the major Irish newspapers going back from the time they were first published. They have loads of English newspapers. They add 100,000 pages of newspapers a week to their offerings, and they're searchable. So unless you have a name like Smith, you can search online for specific places and specific people. It's a great asset. I wouldn't be without it. I started, and I was going to use it for a month, and I just roll over my membership. It's there. It's a great resource, and you don't have to go to Dublin and sit in the National Library at their microfilm machines cranking away. Yes?
I didn't get the name of the book. It was Immigrants and something.
I'm going to come closer.
Oh, okay.
Yes, me too.
It was Immigrants and something.
Immigrants and Exiles.
In Exile.
Oh, she asked the name of the book that I referenced. It's called Immigrants and Exiles, and it's written by Professor Kirby Miller, Kirby Miller. He is considered the leading expert on Irish immigration to America.
Okay.
So you can find that. I think certainly the Chelmsford Library will be able to get it for you.
Okay.
What was that site you just mentioned for newspapers that you told her
Pardon?
about? What was the site for newspapers you just told her?
And it's British Newspaper Archive,
Okay.
but it,
All one word?
yeah. You can just Google it and it'll pop right up. It's not only British newspapers, it's all the Irish newspapers. Like it has the Newry Telegraph on it from 1828 to 1871. So now I have a box of superfluous microfilm sitting in my basement.
And a microfilm reader still?
Nobody wants the old microfilm anymore. Any other questions?
This isn't really a question, but it's a personal story. My grandmother was born in Bainbridge, and I was able to,
Oh!
and I was able
That's
to go
awesome.
there last February. And,
Oh.
they lived on the Ballykelly Road, and I went to Kilpike where the big factory was, the linen factory and everything. So it was a great trip for me. She came over in 1890. However, I don't know too much of the story before that, but she was the product of a Catholic and Protestant marriage. And my great-grandmother had 4 sisters, stayed in Ireland, stayed in County Down. She was the only one who came over, and she was married to the Catholic. So, I know there's more to be had in that story, and I've often wondered what it was like for those 2 people marrying. They got married around 1867, and actually their first child was born before they were able to have a Catholic marriage because she had to convert. It must have been horribly difficult.
Well, I can tell you something about that.
About Banbridge.
She was just saying that she has grandparents
My grandmother was born.
who came from Banbridge, which is just the town north of Derry.
Yeah.
And this was a mixed marriage. This was always an issue. So I'll tell you my mixed marriage story. This is one of James Harshaw's charities, I guess you would say. James hired people to care for them, to work the farms and so forth. I told you about the death of his daughter, Mary. Well, she died after childbirth. And so the baby survived. So now they had an infant with no mother. And so you had to get somebody to nurse the baby. They didn't have formulas and bottles and things. So they hired a woman James in his diaries called Nurse Girl. And she became an important part of the family. She cared for the newborn baby and went everywhere with the family. And so when the baby was weaned, she was paid off and left. But she missed the family so much that she came back, and they kept her, and she stayed. And about the same time, James hired a contract worker. So he went into a hiring fair, which was very common in Ireland, to hire a short-term employee to work his fields. So he hired a guy named Pat. And he came in the fall, and he was going to work till the summer. So anyway, now that I think about this wasn't a mixed marriage, but this was a Protestant arranging a Catholic marriage. So anyway, Pat boy and Nurse Girl fell in love. Now, obviously, Nurse Girl was not in good standing with the Catholic Church because she had had a child out of wedlock. She was not married. And so there was a difficulty in getting a priest who would perform the marriage. So James Harshaw paid a pound, sort of a penalty fee to a local priest so that he would perform this marriage between Nurse Girl and Pat boy. Well, I was curious, and so they actually did get married at the Glen Chapel, which is just west of Banbridge, Loughbrickland. And I thought, oh, I don't know. I knew when they got married, but I did not know their last names. I didn't even know the first name, the Nurse Girl. But fortunately, in the back section of the diaries, he recorded his the names of the people that worked for him. And there was a note that one of his workers had gone, had taken the day off to go to the wedding of Nurse Girl and Pat boy, and he referred to her there as Catherine. So now I had Catherine as the first name and Pat. So I have a friend in Ipswich who has been working on her Catholic genealogy for years, and she went with me on my trips to Dublin. So she was doing genealogy while I was cranking the microfilm machine. So she was an expert on doing research on Catholic marriages. So I sent her an email message. And I said, do you have any records? Do you know of any records, the Catholic Church, this Catholic Church, of a wedding on this particular day? And they're online now. I don't know where they are, but she found them. And I got a message right back from her. And it said that she was Catherine O'Hare, and he was Patrick Kelly. So now I could go searching for them. James Harshaw gave them a lot of money, relatively speaking. They could have come to the United States, so I checked that out first and didn't see any record. Kelly is not an uncommon Irish name. But they turned up on the census records in England. So instead of traveling to America, they actually went to County Durham in England. And I was able to trace them back. They married. Pat had a special aptitude for horses, as many of the Irish did. And so he got a job in an estate there. And so he and Catherine had 10 children. All of them lived to be adults. They were married 50 years before Pat died. When they died, they lived in Newcastle upon Tyne with 5 of their children who had not married. And all of these children were in non-farm jobs. His youngest daughter was a teacher. So here's the lowest level of Irish society, because James gave them a start, ended up, they would have been very comfortable in their old age with all those incomes. But to go back to the basic question, it was very difficult for a Protestant Catholic marriage to stay in Ireland. I cannot tell you how strong the pressures are against any such thing. One of the things that happened in John Martin's exile, there was a lovely Irish family that he sort of linked up with, and they had a daughter that he had kind of a fancy to. But this was a Catholic family, and he knew that if he married this Catholic girl, he would have to stay in Australia. It was fine for them there, but it wouldn't have been fine anywhere in Ireland. And it's difficult even today. The bed and breakfast that I stay in now, a lovely couple. They have a daughter who is a Protestant and married a Catholic. And the minister of the Protestant church that they attended would not marry them. They had to find somebody else. But the families are fine. There's no hostility on either side of the family. So there's some slight improvement. But that was clearly why she would have had to have left.
Well, mine didn't leave for 25 years after that, though. They left in 1890. And I think the families were still close because on all the birth records of the children, Liza, that was my great-grandmother, her sister attended each birth. So I have a feeling they still had a lot to do with each other. You know how on those civil records they say who attended the birth? But something, I don't know, they were married in the registry office, and then the child was baptized, it was a year old. I just don't understand how hard it was, but I do know it was extremely hard. But they stayed 25 years, and then they came. He worked in the linen mills, and around that area, they had these big things where they just bleached the cloth in the fields and everything. It's a very interesting area.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, the museum,
I'm glad I was able to go.
well, the Linen Museum in Lisburn is,
Yeah.
Did you get there?
No, I didn't get there. I tried.
It's a very interesting one, yeah.
I did walk the walk, so I did get
One of
to
the things that she was pointing out that's interesting is that for those people who actually lived in the north, there was some industry. There would have been a lot more industry in Ireland if the British government had not gone to such great lengths to make sure that there was no Irish competition for English industry. Now, I'm going to give you another title. If you really, really, really want to understand how the financial relationships between England and Ireland acted at an extreme disadvantage for the Irish, this book will tell you just one little fact. In 1853, the British government instituted an income tax for the first time. Now, under the Act of Union, there were certain financial arrangements that were agreed upon. Ireland was supposed to contribute so much to the English treasury and so forth. There were rules set up. And this tax violated those rules. And John Martin started talking about it in 1853 to no avail, raising this issue of overtaxation of the Irish. Okay? So to get the full story of this, there is a book, if I can get the title right. The history of the financial and economic relations between Ireland and England from the Reformation by Alice Effie Murray. I am not an economist or even knowledgeable in the subject, but I could understand this. And after about 40 years, the British government finally said, yes, guys, we have been overtaxing Ireland. I mean, here's Ireland without much industry, aside from the linen industry in Ulster. And they're taking this extra money out. So Ireland had been cheated of about £4 million a year. And you add that up for decades, the English were in the hole to the Irish by a lot. Now, I know you expect that the first thing the English Parliament did was say, oops, sorry, and start taxing the English to pay back the Irish. You wouldn't hold your breath for that, and they never paid back 1 penny. But they did something very extraordinary that in a way was almost as good. The property values of Irish property had dropped so low that the rich landowners who owned it owned something that was essentially worthless. And so what the British government did with some of this fund was they bought some of this land, all right? And then anybody who had a lease for the land at the time this went through, which I think was about 1903, the leaseholders were allowed to have their rent apply to ownership of the land. So in the 20th century, Irish farmers actually own their land. In England, that never happened. English farmers do not own the land on the big estates. They rent them, and just like the Irish did. But one of the reasons that they were able to do this was because of this gross overtaxation. This was their way of making amends. And who's to say it didn't work out better in the long run for the Irish? Because if your ancestors are there now, they own the land.
Can you repeat the name of that book again?
Okay, I'm going to try. The key thing is Alice Effie Murray. She's the author. It's the history of the financial and economic, or the other way around, history of Ireland and England from the Reformation. So it goes back a long way. This woman did an incredible piece of work here, because she went back and she read old parliamentary debates when there was an Irish parliament, and it's the only thing she ever wrote was to get her doctorate degree from the School of Economics in London. She was the first one to get one, and she wrote this incredible book, and I recommend it to everybody to really understand the situation and how England cooked the books, essentially. And she was English, so she wasn't doing it from a revolutionary Irish point of view. This was her look at it from an English point of view, and a skilled economist and researcher. I'll tell a family joke. My daughter is sitting in the back. She has this, who's an economist, and she's just not paying attention now. So when he graduated from college, I bought him that book to start his collection of economic history. I don't think he was terribly impressed, but that's what I did. Any other questions? Gee, I usually get questions about Brexit.
I'm interested in knowing if you had more of the story of the Irish ancestor who was put off the land, whose belongings were put on the curb. Were you able to trace that person down?
Margaret McCluskey?
No, it was a gentleman. The eldest son was put off the land.
Oh, yes. She asked if I had traced the eldest of John Harshaw's sons who got put off the land. He had married, he'd married a woman who was the only daughter of a friend of James Harshaw's, Hugh Todd. So, son John married Ellen. James Harshaw married Hugh Todd's daughter, Ellen. Okay, so she was the heir to his property. So after John Harshaw was thrown out of the land, the Harshaw land, he had this land to fall back on. And in fact, it is still owned by the family today. The descendants that came down from John and his wife. The current occupant married a man named Morris Hillis. He is the son of the Headley Hillis that I met who steered me to the townland. So it all goes in circles. And so I've been in the house many times, and I always go there and I think, James Harshaw was here. I've been in the Harshaw house. It still stands, but it's not owned by the Harshaws and hasn't been for well over a century. The Harshaws essentially were impoverished and had nothing. Hugh Harshaw, who I referenced before, was the first Harshaw to actually own any land. He was the eldest of 10 boys. And he was able to get himself a piece of land. And so his son still lives on the land. Interesting also that Hugh kept a diary. He's dead now, but he kept a diary himself. So all through the early part of the Troubles, Hugh was writing as his great-grandfather had done years before. So once you start writing, you keep going. But Brexit is a very tense subject over there because they fear it's going to recreate the hard border. I knew that the Troubles had happened, but I was unaware of what that meant until we went in '92. And that was the Troubles were still going on. And so when you cross the border on the main road there and pull into Newry, there was all sorts of security. It was clear I was in a war zone. The main road had a big cage on it. You were supposed to drive through the cage, or if they thought you were harmless, you could go a roundabout. But it was filled with soldiers. There's a cliff on the left-hand side, and there was a huge military base there. And just beyond the checkpoint there were British military troops in full camouflage with their machine guns. I can assure you I do not feel safer There were people with machine guns standing there in front of me. And they were everywhere. It was 30 years of horrible, horrible times. Just an example, when I did the first book presentation in October in Ireland, I met a man named Eugene Reevy. And he came up and introduced himself to me afterwards. He is one of the members of an organization that's trying to do for Ireland what the reconciliation group did in South Africa. The reason he's so firm on this is he had an experience in the Troubles himself. He lived with a large family in County Armagh, not too far from Newry. And on most Sundays, they were at home watching television. On this particular afternoon, instead of all staying at home, some of the family left. And while they were gone, the UDF, this is the Protestant military group opposing the IRA. So these are the Protestants. They came to his house and killed all three of his brothers that were in the house. So rather than hardening his attitude, he's trying to produce reconciliation. And his partner in this is the person that was involved in a terrorist act closest to Donegal. The people in the bed and breakfast where I stay heard this happen. There was a Protestant terrorist gang operating in the area. They were the ones that were responsible for the Reevy's murder. They also had another plan. This was a time when a lot of small bands were formed, and they would perform in various small places. And this particular show band was the Miami show band, and they had been performing in Bambridge. So they were on their way back to the Republic, and they encountered what they thought was an ordinary roadblock. And they were told to get out, and they did so. There were about 7 or 8 members of the band. There was a British soldier standing there, so they thought it was a legitimate roadblock. One of the members of the intercepting group there went around to the back, presumably to check the musical instruments, but he had a bomb with him. The idea was they were going to put a bomb in the van. It would blow up in the Republic, and this would be something that they could blame the Republic on for terrorism and not the local Protestants. But it went off prematurely and exploded at the back. Then the rest of the members of the crew brought out their machine guns and started machine gunning the rest of the band who was standing there. And this all happened within sound of Donegal, where James Harshaw was. Only a couple of them escaped. One of them that escaped has partnered with Eugene Reevy in this effort to bring reconciliation to Northern Ireland. Now, the odd thing about this, it's not funny, the head of this local group was credited, if that's the word, with murdering 40 Catholics. He was never charged, or he was briefly arrested, but never charged, because he was working with the British government. He later died of natural causes, and he's buried in the same cemetery that John Martin is buried in, about from here to there, away. So here's this grave for a man who fought for Irish independence, and Robert Jackson, his name was, who was a terrible mass killer fighting to maintain British control and subjugation of the Catholics. Side by side for eternity. So thank you all very much for coming. It's been fun.